Good evening. My guest tonight is Kelly Jewell. He is a Barron County native, graduated from the Barron County High School. He is a graduate of the University of Louisville. He works for Ford Motor Company, and he's an amateur historian. Since the 4th of July is approaching very rapidly, I thought it would be well to discuss the origins of this country and how it became a nation, and how there are many similarities in today's life and today's history to what happened in the early days of the formation of this country. Kelly, I guess we should start with why people came to this country in the first place, because that had a lot to do with the character of the people and what caused them to act the way they did a few years later.
Well, that's true, Mr. Barrickman. First, I'd like to thank you for inviting me to be on the program tonight. But to answer your question, the majority of the settlers that came to the New World, as it was called then, came for basically one word: freedom. Freedom to live the way they wanted to, freedom to worship God as they wanted to, and there was an expanse of land that they could settle on with the freedom that they could go as they pleased, and at least in the beginning they had no one to tell them what to do, and there was, at that time in Europe, there was a lot of upheaval religiously and from a warfare standpoint with England, France, Spain, and so people were looking for somewhere where they could escape that, and the New World was a place where they could do that.
And of course, at the same time the war was going on in Europe, there was a French and Indian War involving the British and the Americans in what later became this country.
That's correct.
About how long did that last? Do you remember?
I think the approximately 7 years. The French and Indian War, I think, started in 1754 and ended in 1763. And in Europe, they called the conflict the 7 Years' War, and in America, they called it the French and Indian War. And it ran parallel on both sides of the ocean.
And of course, one of the things that did occur, and I suppose was necessary to occur, during that period, there was a lot of the settlers in this country that joined with the British to fight the French.
That is true. There was a large group of colonists that did join with the British soldiers. As a matter of fact, 21-year-old George Washington was a major in the Virginia militia, and they served with the British forces in the French and Indian War. And that's how George Washington gained his first military experience, was from the French and Indian War, which would serve him to a large extent during the Revolutionary War later.
Now, when the war ended, the British, and by the time it ended, the British had expended, of course, a lot of money in support of the war and winning it. And in the meantime, what was the government here at the time of the end of the war? I mean, how was the colonies governed?
Well, the colonies, it varied somewhat depending upon which colony that you're referring to, but some of the colonies, Rhode Island, for example, had a state constitution because of the way their charter was originally set up, was a very self-governing colony with almost no interference from the British government whatsoever. Some of the other colonies were called royal colonies, and they had a royal governor, and generally there was an assembly elected by the people, and then that assembly elected a council that governed over them. And during the years just prior to the Revolutionary War, That was basically the government that was in place, except just before the war there were certain acts the British Parliament did that actually abolished some of those state governments, and obviously that was one of the things that led to the uprising of the colonists to declare their independence.
Now, what were some of those things that happened?
Well, it started over a period of years. Actually, in the 1730s, there was an act passed by Parliament called the Molasses Act that taxed the importation of sugar from the British West Indies, which a lot of the colonists in the the New England section made rum, and that Molasses Act caused the merchants to have difficulty and higher prices and difficulty in selling their wares, and that was a source of aggravation. But actually the British government at the time didn't really enforce that a great deal, so Americans actually smuggled during that period of time. But in the 1760s, the British government changed hands and they instituted the Sugar Act.
Now, by the British government, what do you mean?
Well, the Parliament itself, and of course with the Prime Minister, but basically the Parliament is what and the King is what the American people, or at that time the colonists, would refer to as Parliament and the King.
Did the colonists have any representation in that Parliament?
Not directly. The way the Parliament system worked in England was that each class supposedly was represented in the Parliament. There was large areas in England, for example, even in London, that the people did not actually vote directly for representatives in Parliament, and neither did the colonies. None of the colonies did. But the English people and the Parliament felt like the colonies did have representation in Parliament, even though it was not direct representation, and obviously the colonies didn't like that fact.
Now let's get back to, you mentioned the Molasses Act. Let's move on to some of the other things that Parliament did and other taxation.
Well, the Sugar Act, I believe in 1764, built on the Molasses Act, but this time the British government decided they were going to enforce it. And obviously that caused problem. A year later they passed the Stamp Act. The Stamp Act, in simple terms, basically it required a tax on every paper that a colonist had to file, any kind of license for a business, for marriage, for, well, any government function that required any type of paperwork. There was a tax upon that, and the colonists resented that greatly and demanded that it be repealed. You have to remember that the colonists considered themselves British subjects, and therefore they thought they were entitled to all the rights that an Englishman living in London would be entitled to, and they felt like that was an unfair tax upon them, and they felt that being they had no representation in Parliament, that was unfair. They felt the only tax that should be put upon them would have to be brought upon by the state governments that they were electing, like the Virginia House of Burgesses, which George Washington at one time was a member.
And so as a result of that, that's how the expression taxation without representation
That is correct.
came up.
That's correct.
Now, as a result of their opposition to these taxes, how did the colonists show that?
Well, they wrote letters of grievance. They founded committees of, I think they called it committees of safety, and they wrote letters to Parliament. They wrote letters to the King, declaring that they were being taxed unfairly, that they were not being treated as proper British subjects. For the most part, the colonies did have some friends in England that took their case to Parliament, and some of those acts that I mentioned eventually were repealed. But the only trouble is that every time they would repeal one, it seems like the British government would institute a new one that was just as bad or worse than the previous one, and of course it kept the colonists constantly guessing, well, what would be next? And they felt like their liberty was in danger continuously because of this. And the British government changed hands at least once or twice during that period of time as far as Prime Minister goes, and the minister in charge of the colonies changed a couple of times, and also every time a new person would come into play, they would obviously have their own agenda. And the bottom line that the British wanted to do to the colonies was they wanted the colonies to help support themselves. There was a huge cost to the British government for maintaining the colonies, for protection of the colonies, for the large British naval fleet that had to be used to protect the colonies from the French, from the Spanish. And Parliament felt like that the colonists should be paying part of that expense. And those taxes that we previously talked about was one way to do that. And unfortunately, the colonists resented it. And probably if it had been handled a different way, the Revolutionary War probably would have been postponed possibly a generation. But the British government made mistakes in the way they handled the colonists. 3,000-mile separation between the mother country and the colonies led to a lot of misunderstanding and miscommunication.
Did the colonists demonstrate, so to speak, using terminology of today, that they have any mass demonstrations against the taxes that the government was imposing?
They did. There was a group known as the Sons of Liberty. Samuel Adams was a prominent member of that from Massachusetts. Patrick Henry, of course, from Virginia, and they were the more radical members of the colonists. You have to remember that a lot of the colonists still supported Great Britain regardless of what they did to them. But there were demonstrations, and of course, as the British probably and some of the colonists feared, eventually it came to a bloodshed. Really, it was an accident, but it happened in Boston in 1770, which there were a group of colonists that, and some of them I think were described as young boys, that were taunting some British soldiers that were on guard outside of a custom house, and they had thrown some snowballs and things, as boys sometimes do, but they had carried it a little bit too far, and there got to be a mob involved. And the British soldiers, probably actually fearing for their own safety, they heard a shout. Some of those soldiers mistook that as an order to fire, and 4 colonists were killed. And it was known through the press as the Boston Massacre, and that was in March of 1770. And of course, that outraged colonists all the way up and down the seaboard.
So in those early days, we had demonstrations that are somewhat similar. The demonstrations that we're having in this country today, thinking of Cincinnati in particular.
Right.
And for different reasons, but you still have the public reaction to certain things which they figure is oppressive.
That's correct.
From the standpoint of the government. Now, you mentioned Samuel Adams. He and John, that we'll talk more about later, were cousins.
That's correct.
John was a graduate of Harvard University and also of its law school. And there were 6 of the British soldiers that fired that were indicted.
That's correct.
And were tried, and John Adams represented them.
That's
and
correct.
Cleared 4 of them.
That is correct. 2 were acquitted, and I think actually later were released, but 2 were acquitted and 4 were, 4 were acquitted and 2 were convicted. That's correct.
So there again, you have parallels of what's going on as a result of demonstrations, court actions, and so forth.
Absolutely.
And then what was next insofar, how did we get to the Tea Party?
Well, of course, the Boston Massacre was in 1770, and the Boston Tea Party was in 1773. And during that period of time, there were still various demonstrations. There was letters sent demanding that the colonists be allowed to represent themselves. At various times, some of the charters supposedly were revoked. Some of the governments, the self-governments, were disbanded, especially in Massachusetts. And so it was just kind of a continuing uproar until the Tea Act of 1773, which Parliament actually thought was a good idea. They thought that this was a way for the colonists to have tea cheaper than they had ever been able to buy it before, because there had always been a tax on tea, and they actually cut the tax on the tea. The reason for that was because there was a London-held company that had millions of pounds of tea in London that they couldn't sell. So they decided, as a way to help that company, was to send it to America, and they thought the Americans would buy it by lowering the price. The only trouble was for the Americans is it seemed to them that this company now had a monopoly on all the tea sold in America, and they resented it. So in some ports they refused to let the ships come in. In Charleston they refused to let ships come in. They stored the tea, what did come in areas where they knew it would rot, so it would be wouldn't be able to be sold. But the royal governor let a ship come into Boston Harbor. And so one night, some of the colonists dressed up as Indians, so they wouldn't know exactly who did it. They boarded the ship and they threw it overboard. And of course, the colonists celebrated their victory of getting rid of this tea. Unfortunately, Parliament was not amused by this act whatsoever. And the Boston Tea Party led to some acts that were called the Intolerable Acts of 1773, one which closed Boston Harbor completely until the colonists paid for the tea that they throwed overboard, which they had no intention of paying for. And so that roused up sentiment throughout the colonies. Just as like today, if there was a disaster, the Red Cross and different communities would bring in food and cargo to help those people. Well, the colonies did the same thing for the city of Boston so that they could continue to have goods and so forth. So that was at least one of the straws that really broke it wide open, was the Boston Tea Party.
Now, well, first of all, it was certainly, the Boston Tea Party was certainly a very contributing factor to the first, what I call, engagement between the what turned out to be the American militia and the British forces. Now, when and where did that occur, the very first one?
Well, as they say, the shot heard round the world happened in Lexington and Concord in April the 19th, 1775. The general in Boston found out that there was a store of powder and shot in a colonial store, and he intended to go get it from the colonists. And when he tried to get it, that's when the Minutemen, the farmers that were supposed to be ready on a minute's notice, came out, and they actually had confrontation. And so that was the actual beginning of the war itself.
And then when was the next engagement?
The next engagement, well, really, the colonists harassed the British all the way back to Boston right after that, as they decided that maybe they had better go back where it was safe. The next engagement would be Bunker Hill, the next major engagement. And Bunker Hill kind of is a situation where it's kind of a defeat, but it's also a victory, because it was a defeat from the standpoint that the colonists actually had to retreat from Bunker Hill. But the only reason they retreated was because they actually ran out of ammunition and gunpowder. But it was a victory from the standpoint that they actually withheld 3 frontal attacks by the British regulars that were in Boston, and held it quite well. And they didn't actually take the hill until the Americans had left. So it was considered kind of a defeat, but it was also a great moral victory for the colonists.
But it was also a costly defeat for the British.
Yes, it was. There were at least a couple hundred, if not several hundred, British soldiers killed and wounded during that confrontation.
Now, it was during that battle that a black man was given credit for allowing the retreat by having killed the general or major officer that was leading the attack.
That's correct.
And I can't remember his name now, but again, it brings out the fact that even in the early history of this country, the blacks had something to do with it, and before the war ended, there were a lot of blacks that were soldiers, and of course one way they got them in there was they would free them if they would agree to join the militia.
That is correct.
And that's how they got a lot of blacks that were in there and contributed greatly in the war all the way to its conclusion. We're talking about the militia here. I think we'd better discuss a little bit what we mean by that, how it was formed, and so forth and so on.
Well, the colonies always had a militia or a citizen defense from the very beginning because of the Indians that they had to encounter. A lot of the Indian tribes were not too happy with the colonists when they first settled, and it required defense from the very beginning, and that certainly continued through the days, and also with the French and the Spanish to the south and the French to the west and to the north. So there was always a citizen soldier, as you might call it, what we would call today the National Guard, and so they were there, and so that was what the colonists first started to use as their defense against the British during the Revolutionary War, was this militia. And so it was just the ordinary farmer that would get his gun from over the fireplace and go out to defend his own property and the property of his neighbors.
Were they paid anything like the National Guard is today?
Well, they were at the very beginning, such as at Lexington Concord, no, not really. But once that General Washington was given the command, or made commander-in-chief of the Continental Army in 1775, they did offer to pay the people that would join the military. The only trouble is the Continental Congress really didn't have any money to mount anything, as far as gold and silver goes anyway. So they promised them payment, but a lot of times they didn't receive any payment, or if they did, it was a paper that was close to worthless. There was a term that was coined during that period of time, not worth a continental, and that came from the fact the money the Continental Congress issued was worthless.
And we still hear that term today.
Right, it's carried all the way through.
Did they have enlistments, or did they, and if so, for what term, or did, when there was a need for them, they just came together?
Well, actually both. They did try to encourage people to enlist so they could have a regular standing army that would be there when needed. But a lot of the times, it was actually when the British were in an area, that's when the army came in. General Washington once made the statement that what he needed was not a large army, but a good army. He never had more than 18,000 troops under his command at any one time. And that number sometimes would swell in certain areas where some of those farmers would come out and they would help with the battle. But then when that battle was over, or the British would move somewhere else, they would go home. And a lot of times, we always hear about Valley Forge. There was only about 3,000 men in the Army during that period of time. Most of the rest had gone home.
You mentioned the Continental Congress. What was the Continental Congress?
Well, it first met in 1774 in response to the Tea Act, the Intolerable Acts that were passed the year before. It was originally designed as a formal grievance to Britain. At that time, they, or some of the colonists, I'm sure, already wanted to declare their independence, but at least most of them at that period of time did not want to separate from Great Britain. They simply wanted to make Great Britain hear them, that they needed to be treated better and they needed representation, and as far as the taxes and so forth went. So the First Continental Congress really did little other than to put forth a formal petition of grievances, in other words. But they did agree to meet a year later if those grievances hadn't been met by the British government. And they did.
Well, the government didn't, and the colonists did.
Right. in April, as we point out, in April 1775, we had the first actual engagements. The Second Continental Congress met in May of 1775. And of course, they realized at that point they were pretty much too far to turn back at that point, even though independence was not declared for another year. But the most important thing that came out of the Second Continental Congress was the installation of General Washington as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. And he took command of that in July of 1775.
Now we come back to John Adams. He's the one that proposed Washington as the commanding general.
That's correct. General Washington was actually a compromise.
But
because
he was Adams's proponent. Adams was his proponent.
Correct.
Compromise.
Right. The colonies didn't really get along all that well, especially North and South, even though it's just like it was even in the Civil War, North and South, and the reason they didn't get along is primarily because they had two different economic systems, which they carried on for a great period of time after that. But so General Washington was a compromise. He was a Southern planter, and the Southern planters or the Southern colonies did not want a New England general. And as you point out, John Adams was a great proponent of George Washington, and of course George Washington had a great deal of experience militarily, serving as later a colonel with the Virginia militia, and his reputation was already known throughout the colonies because of his involvement in some of the councils that had been petitioning the British, as well as his membership in the Virginia House of Burgesses at a little bit younger age.
In the South, it was mostly landed gentry.
That's correct.
And in the North, it was mostly people that were interested in marketing people.
Right. More of a mercantile society in
Right.
the North.
So there was, even in the beginning of the war, there was quite a few British supporters.
Absolutely.
And quite a few of them remained that way up until and even after the end of the war.
That's true. It's estimated that as many as 50,000 colonists actually took up arms against the Patriots and actually fought with the British. And there was many more that may have not actually taken up arms, but were on the British side that simply tried to stay out of everyone's way, I suppose. And a lot of those people lost their homes, their businesses, because the Patriots sometimes seized their property when they found out that they were, as they called them, Tories.
I read an interesting story once about there was one young man in one community, I think in the state of New York, as I remember, that was always defending the British and castigating the colonists. And the women of the community got tired of it, tired of hearing about it, and they collared him, stripped him down to his waist, and used grease and greased him, and used some feathers and so forth,
That's right.
and tarred and feathered him. I take it you've read that story.
I have read that. Apparently that was a common form of punishment in those days for tar and feathering. I don't know exactly what usually constituted the need for that, but I have read that they have done that before. So, and they did do that to Tories.
I thought it was interesting that the women of the communities were the ones that collared him and worked him over. Now, after General Washington took command, what was the next major engagement?
Well, it would be the battle for the New York area, at least as where the British troops were in New York, and General Washington surrounded New York. However, he ended up having to withdraw. A lot of people don't realize that we lost as many battles as we won during the Revolutionary War, and we did not actually regain New York until the war was pretty much over. So General Washington, his first major battle, you could say he lost it. He had to retreat across the Delaware River into probably into now, and it may be Delaware, but he had to retreat across the Delaware River from New York to protect his force from the British soldiers.
But you also had a major engagement, didn't you, as far as the northern part of New York and Canada was concerned?
Well, that's true. There was a victory up there with Benedict Arnold.
Benedict Arnold, right.
Who at that time, of course, everybody remembers Benedict Arnold as being a traitor, and he was, but not at that point in time. He was actually one of the better generals in the Revolutionary War at that time, and was considered a great patriot, and had quite a bit of success up in the Quebec area. And of course, later I guess he received an offer from the British, and he did turn. And of course, that term became part of the American vocabulary. If someone is considered a Benedict Arnold, everyone knows that that person is a traitor. So that stained his name forever. But at that time, he was a fine general.
And then, of course, after New York, we won't get into all of these battles now, but you had Valley Forge.
Right.
And the British, as I recall, the British then tried to move the war to the south.
That is correct. Of course, one thing we probably shouldn't overlook is after the withdrawal to New York, that was close to Christmas, and that was the British had hired a great deal of Hessian soldiers to actually fight for them, about 10,000 of them. And the British felt pretty comfortable that Christmas, and those soldiers were celebrating quite a bit. And one of the great strokes of Washington's genius was he decided that that was the perfect night to attack. So that's the night that Washington crossed the Delaware, as the great painting shows Washington in the boat leading his troops. They crossed the Delaware River, and they completely surprised the Hessians and took Trenton. I guess that was Trenton, New Jersey, and then went on to Princeton. And that was that was probably, I guess, the first great victory for Washington, and that helped rally his men for the rest of that winter quite a bit. That was, I think, the year before, actually, Valley Forge, where they settled down for that winter that most people are familiar with, where they almost starved to death during Valley Forge.
That was a great, the Delaware victory, what I call the Delaware victory, although it ended in New Jersey, that was a good morale builder.
It was indeed.
That certainly helped. And then the British attempted to, and did to a certain extent, move the war to the south.
That's true. They felt like that there were more colonists that might be sympathetic to their cause in the southern colonies than in New England, where really a lot of the trouble had always been stirred up, especially in Massachusetts. So they decided that maybe it'd be better to move it to the south. But unfortunately, they didn't have a lot of success there. With the British Navy, they could always pretty much conquer any seaport that they wanted to. They went into Charleston, South Carolina, and they captured that. But anytime they started to move inland, they ran into problems. As a matter of fact, one battle in close to South Carolina and North Carolina, the two generals that caused the defeat of the British force was actually Isaac Shelby and John Sevier, who those two gentlemen would later become the governor. Isaac Shelby would become the first governor of the Commonwealth of Kentucky, and John Sevier would be the first governor of the state of Tennessee. And that's how they earned their reputation, was in the Revolutionary War. And they defeated the British at Cowpens and Kings Mountain, I believe it was, and caused the British to have to retreat back toward the coastal areas of the Carolinas and Georgia.
And there was some action as far as Shelby was concerned in the Northwest Territories, Vincennes and so forth.
Right, and George Rogers Clark.
Yeah.
Who would actually be the founder of the city of Louisville.
City of Louisville.
Right. He had a victory at Vincennes that.
It was Clark instead of Isaac Shelby. I was wrong about that. I was thinking about the wrong man. But it was Clark. So the founders and settlers in Kentucky contributed to the war.
Absolutely.
more than I think the public generally realized.
Probably so. Supposedly the last battle of the Revolutionary War was actually in Kentucky I believe it's Blue Licks, where that Daniel Boone was actually a colonel, and I suppose that would be called like the Kentucky Militia, and they were attacked by a group of British and Indians, and were actually defeated during that engagement because it was an overwhelming force of British and Indians against the colonists that Daniel Boone was involved with. But that's considered the last battle of the Revolutionary War. I think that was actually after the surrender of Cornwallis at Yorktown. So
we've been talking about the battles, the various engagements, and as in doing that, we passed over the Declaration of Independence.
yes, we did.
So let's talk about that a little bit.
Well, of course, most everyone knows that the Declaration of Independence was adopted on July the 4th, 1776. But probably what they don't realize is that most people think Thomas Jefferson had the sole responsibility of writing that. Not completely. He was given the task of actually putting it on paper, but there were other people that had input into that declaration, men such as John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, and others. And they actually made some changes to it before it was actually adopted in the Continental Congress on July the 4th.
Now, just what did the Declaration of Independence accomplish?
Well, it accomplished really the purpose for the colonies to be free. It pointed out that all people have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that any government that doesn't provide that either needs to be changed or abolished. And it provided that government should be by the consent of the people instead of from a king or some monarch, or a way that the people themselves couldn't have an effect on it. And also it actually listed the grievances of the colonies to the King of England for specifically what had been done to them over the last 30 or 40 years. A lot of times people don't realize that. The other part of the Declaration that no one reads is all those specific charges. And of course it declared our independence, that we had no ties whatsoever anymore with Great Britain, and that they were staking, as it says, their lives and their sacred honor on breaking that bond.
Insofar as that was concerned, it was not the instrument that founded the American government. All it did was establish the independence of each state.
That is correct.
And it more or less formed 13 nations.
That is true.
Which
really
we'll get back to shortly. When did the war end?
Well, for all intents and purposes, it ended in 1781 when Cornwallis surrendered approximately 7,000 to 8,000 British troops at Yorktown. And that was a battle that General Washington himself was in charge of. We had the British fleet, or excuse me, not the British, the French fleet blocked the harbor so that the British couldn't escape. And we pretty much, along with some French troops, had Cornwallis surrounded, cut off his supply lines, and he had to surrender his entire complement to General Washington. And that was in 1781, but the actual treaty that ended the war was not until 1783, and that was called the Treaty of Paris. That part of that was negotiated by John Adams, and I believe John Jay and Benjamin Franklin.
Benjamin Franklin. Again, Adams runs through all of this
That's
stuff.
true.
And,
he doesn't get a lot of credit in American history.
He doesn't get a credit in American history, but he certainly had an awful lot to do with it. Now, after the war was over, how did we get to forming the government of the United States? What brought that about?
Well, after Yorktown, they formed what the Continental Congress had been running things up to that point, and so they decided after the war was over, they had what they called the Articles of Confederation, And that actually began in 1781 and ran through till the Constitution took over. The problem with the Articles of Confederation is it was a very weak form of government. They couldn't tax anyone. They could request money from states, but if those states refused, they had no way to get the money to operate the government. All the states could still coin their own money, print their own money. They could actually still have relations with foreign governments. And so even though there was supposed to be a central government, it was a very weak central government, and each state still pretty much ran their affairs the way they wanted to. And other nations such as Spain and France and even Great Britain, you know, it was very difficult for them to have any treaties or dealings with the country whatsoever, because, as you pointed out, there were like 13 separate countries. And so how do you make a treaty with a government called the Articles of Confederation when they knew simply well that probably most of those other states wouldn't agree to that? And so they laughed at this government, these other nations did, because it was so weak.
There wasn't any control of commerce among the states either.
Absolutely. One state would tax the other one on what they imported, and the other state would tax the stuff that was exported by that. And so there was constant bickering and rivalry between states.
Now, as I recall, there was a meeting between Alexander Hamilton and James Madison to try to work out some of these problems about commerce among the states.
That's true.
And that led to, they finally, those two essentially came up with the idea of a constitutional convention.
That's true. They tried to have a meeting to work out some of those problems, as you pointed out, and only representatives, I believe, from 5 of the states attended, and they decided that what they needed was, you might say, an overhaul of the entire Articles of Confederation. And so that's what they began to push to all the states. The only trouble was, before they could have a constitutional convention, all the states had to agree to it. So, as you point out, probably at that point Hamilton and Madison and some others actually knew what they wanted. They wanted to do away with the Articles of Confederation altogether and have a new government. But they couldn't really expound on that too much, because they knew if they did, the states would never agree to a constitutional convention to begin with. So they went in 1787 with the idea, or at least that was supposed to be the idea, to simply rework or change the Articles of Confederation. And what they ended up with was a completely new government.
As it met and so forth, there was little doubt apparently among the members that the government should be a representative government of the people, but the means of accomplishing that caused quite a debate.
Absolutely.
Do you remember anything about that?
I do indeed. To start out with, there was the Virginia plan that was proposed by Madison and the other members of the Virginia delegation, which was a very simple form of government. It was a completely representative form. The number of representatives from each state would be made up solely by the population. And of course, the smaller states, such as New Jersey and Delaware, Connecticut, all of those smaller New England states objected to that vehemently, because they knew that they wouldn't have equal representation. And they felt like then the southern colonies, which were geographically larger and some of them had more population, especially Virginia at that time was the most populous colony, would control the government, and they would have no say in it whatsoever. So they said if that was the only plan, they were not going to ratify any kind of constitution whatsoever. So there was another plan put forth called the New Jersey plan, which provided for equal representation based upon each state and not on population. Of course, then states like Virginia said, well, do we have to, is our 50 people from Connecticut more important than 150 from Virginia? So what they ended up with, obviously, was a compromise, where that they came up with a lower house that would be represented solely by population, and an upper house which would be represented equally with all states. So that was the compromise that they worked out between them. Took them quite some time to do that.
And then, of course, they had to have a court system.
Right.
So they had to form another element of the government.
That's correct. The judicial branch, really the only specific court named in the Constitution is the Supreme Court. But it gives the power for the Congress to make a federal or judicial system, which that's one of the jobs the very first Congress did, was to start forming the federal judicial system. But it only named the Supreme Court specifically. And a lot of people don't realize that the Supreme Court, at least in the Constitution, does not have the responsibility of declaring acts unconstitutional or not. That was something that was done later.
Were there any civil rights, specific civil rights mentioned in the original constitutional document?
Well, if you mean as far as from a representation
No, I'm
standpoint.
talking about the civil rights that finally ended up as the first 10 amendments.
Oh, okay. Well, it's kind of an interesting story, the fact that Madison and others insisted that those rights were in the Constitution, but they were not specifically named. And most of the states actually had a Bill of Rights of some form or fashion that did declare those rights very specifically. And so several of the states only adopted the Constitution based upon the fact that as soon as Congress met, that they would have a Bill of Rights that would spell out such things as freedom of the press, freedom of religion specifically, and they did do that.
That's how we got the first 10 amendments
That is
of
correct.
the Constitution.
That's correct.
And of course, the means of amending was in the original Constitution.
Right. That's considered one of its greatest virtues, is the fact that even though it's a fairly rigid document, it's also flexible in the fact that it can be changed as time goes on and as conditions warrant. But it's only been changed not that many times, considering in 200 years I think there's 26 amendments.
Now, while all this was going on, where was Jefferson?
I believe Jefferson was in France at the time. He was not in favor of this convention whatsoever. There were several of the former, you might say, radical revolutionaries that were not in favor. Patrick Henry said that he smelt a rat in this convention. Now, of course, all of the deliberations of this convention were held in utmost secrecy during the actual time of the convention. And so Jefferson thought it was a bad idea. Patrick Henry thought it was a bad idea. And several others. Samuel Adams was not elected as a delegate to attend this. I don't think he was in favor of this also. Afraid of too strong of a central government. They wanted to have those independent states. Even though that didn't work very well, but they were afraid of the alternatives.
So there, at that early stage, the faction between those who favored a strong federal government and those who favored states' rights
Absolutely.
actually began. That's where it began.
That's where it began. That's true.
And it showed up, as I recall, even in the Washington's first administration.
Yes.
And Adams, during that administration, was off to Europe trying to establish relations and improve relations with the various countries over there now that they had a nation.
Right.
But Jefferson was Secretary of State.
That's correct.
And then you still had Hamilton.
Right. Who was Secretary of the Treasury.
Now, what was the differences that were developing between them?
Well, Hamilton was, as they would later be called, Federalist. He believed in a very strong central government. And he also felt like that the more well-to-do and rich should actually run the government. And Jefferson had just the absolute opposite viewpoint. He believed strongly in what he wrote in the Declaration of Independence, that the government should be by the consent of the people. And he felt like that the average people should have as much role and voice in government as possible. So he became what at that time was simply called anti-federalist, which would later be called Democratic Republicans. But their viewpoints were as far apart as you could possibly get, and they were serving in the same cabinet together, which I'm sure caused President Washington some problems.
And then that continued on with Washington's ending of the second term and the election for his successor.
Right.
What happened there?
Well, in the election of 1796, of course, as you point out, Washington had announced he would not seek a third term. And of course, our recent problems with the Electoral College and selection of a president was even worse in those days, because the way it worked is they still had an Electoral College, but whoever got the most votes was president, and whoever got the second most votes was vice president. So what you ended up with was John Adams got the most votes and became president, and Thomas Jefferson got the second largest tally, and he became the vice president. So it would be like having President Bush and Al Gore as vice president. So that was obviously trouble right from the very beginning. That was really the beginning of the technical two-party system at that point. And now we had one party as president and one party as vice president.
Going back a bit, at that time, the senators, the United States senators, were elected by the states.
That's correct, state legislatures.
State legislatures,
Mm-hmm.
and that, again, went back to the New Jersey plan.
That's correct.
So now, Hamilton, as you pointed out, wanted a very strong government. So what happened then insofar as the control of commerce and money was concerned, banking?
Well, Hamilton felt like that if the United States didn't get its credit in check, that we would never be able to have commerce with other nations. So he proposed that we pay off all our debts, and that to do that and to maintain a good currency system, that we need a national bank. And that may look good on the surface, but Jefferson was diametrically opposed to that.
That set off a good one.
Yes, it was. And that national bank, that was one of those things that President Washington had to come down the side of either Hamilton or Jefferson, and he came down the side of Hamilton on that particular situation. And the Congress did adopt a national bank of the United States. And it did work for the intentions that Hamilton intended it to. It did help level the currency system, and it did help the United States pay its debts. But unfortunately, it also made a lot of people rich. And Jefferson always thought the more people that became rich, the less power that the ordinary common person had, and he was always against that.
And then they had the election, the next presidential election. Jefferson defeated Adams.
That's correct.
I think it is interesting, we're talking about the differences among the two groups at the formation of the government and then immediately thereafter, and yet the issues that were prevalent then have never been resolved.
That's true. They haven't. The two, if you take today's Democrat and Republican Party and boil it all the way down, it's still big government versus, or maybe I shouldn't say big, just a strong government versus a weaker form of the government. And that was what Hamilton and Jefferson debated over. That's what was debated on in the Constitutional Convention, and it's still debated on today. Just the issues are different, but the core argument or core beliefs are still the same.
It's rather amusing that how names have changed.
That's true.
The Federalists became the Republican Party,
That's true.
and then the Democrats was of Jefferson's. I mean, Jefferson's idea became the Democrats, and expanded quite a bit by Andrew Jackson.
Right.
And then that went on through the Civil War and after the war, and again with states' rights people and so forth,
Absolutely.
mainly in the South, and the federal government, I mean the big government, large government, and strong government idea were supported by the people in the North. And now the situation again, as far as name, has changed.
That's right.
The Republican Party has become the states' rights
That's
party,
right.
and the Democratic Party has become the Republican Party insofar as ideology is concerned.
That's true.
But again, I don't think that people generally recognize that. But again, it shows that ideas don't change too much, and you still got the same conflict
Right.
between, you got the same conflict between two basic ideas that was present when this government started
Absolutely.
and is still present today, and we're still fighting over it, still fussing over it, and so forth. And of course, again, it was that idea that, and the conflict between those two ideas, that brought about the Civil War.
Absolutely.
And even the Civil War didn't resolve it.
That's true. That's true.
It resolved it temporarily, but it did not resolve it. I think that it's well for the public to realize, and I don't think they do. You ask the average citizen out here, how was the United States formed? And they'll say the Declaration of Independence. That is not true, of course, but of course that was an important document. But the main thing and the main idea I had about this program, and incidentally you've done an excellent job, you're a good historian.
Well, thank you.
You know your history. But the main idea I had for this program was hopefully the public would realize what this nation actually cost in the way of misery and sacrifices and so forth.
Absolutely.
By the people who founded it, and again, on a comparative basis, how well off we are today. And yet we really complain and bitch about things as badly, as loudly and so forth as they did then, but we don't have as good a basis as we had at that time.
Right.
And another thing that I have hated to see disregarded in principle, it used to be that you had a big celebration every 4th of July, reminding the people what had happened and why we were celebrating it. And now it's just a vacation for everybody, a few days off.
Right.
And which shows that we aren't too grateful for what happened in the past. Kelly, I appreciate you coming. We've had a good program. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on.